The Task Force to Investigate Terrorism Financing will come to order. The title of today's Task Force hearing is Trading with the Enemy. Trade-based money laundering is the growth industry in terror finance. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the Task Force at any time. And without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. The Chair now recognizes himself for 3 minutes for an opening statement. On March 25, 2015, under the leadership of Chairman Jeb Hensarling, the House Committee on Financial Services adopted a resolution creating the Task Force to Investigate Terrorism Financing. The aim of this task force has been to assess the effectiveness of our current anti-money laundering and counter-terror finance efforts and tools when faced with a world containing new and evolving threats. With Ranking Member Stephen Lynch, Vice Chair Robert Pittenger, and a bipartisan group of 21 members, the task force has been able to conduct 5 hearings, several briefings, information sessions, as well as a CODEL to meet with regional partners and discuss their efforts to counter terrorism financing. The initial 6 months of operation shed significant light on multiple issues with regards to counter threats finance and anti-money laundering initiatives. First was the discovery of the various revenue streams ISIS utilizes to fund its terror operation and the ways in which the United States may effectively counter them, such as continuing to target IS oil infrastructure, work with regional allies to close porous borders, and to better police the travel of foreign fighters. Second, the task force brought about a consensus that there's a need for greater information sharing throughout the financial system and between government agencies, as well as an increased integration of government databases. Finally, it became evident through witness testimony and numerous briefings that Congress needs to act on beneficial ownership and to provide the appropriate agencies with sufficient resources to address current challenges. Building on what we know and have learned, this session will take a much closer look at several lesser-known methodologies that have been mentioned in previous briefings and hearings, including trade-based money laundering, terror funding streams from Latin America, developing our regional partners' capabilities to combat terror financing, and the funding of foreign-based terrorists. Today, we aim to take a closer look at trade-based money laundering, or process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through the use of trade transactions in an attempt to legitimize their illicit origins. This practice allows hundreds of billions of dollars to be laundered annually and cannot be allowed to continue. It is our hope that with the help of our expert witnesses, that this body will walk away with a better understanding of the problem, as well as an effective measure to curb and combat this practice. On Monday, DEA and European authorities were able to uncover a massive Hezbollah drug and money laundering scheme that was intent on providing financial assets to militants in Syria. This development depicts the scale of this problem and the urgent need to devote more focus towards it. And unless there's any objection, I'll ask for unanimous consent to put this DEA release into the record. Hearing no objection, it is admitted. This hearing marks the beginning of another 6 months of investigation and an additional step towards snubbing out the resources necessary for these nefarious groups to grow and to thrive. I now recognize for an opening statement the ranking member of the task force, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you very much to Mr. Chairman, and also to Chairman Hensarling, Ranking Members Waters, and Vice Chair Pittenger for holding today's hearing. I also want to thank our witnesses for helping this committee with its important work. This hearing will give us a much-needed opportunity to examine trade-based money laundering nexus to terrorist finance. Trade-based money laundering involves using trade in products or commodities to transfer value in order to divert and obscure the true nature of illicit wealth. Currently, there's an ample opportunity for terrorist groups to exploit the international trade system with low risk of being caught. According to the Financial Action Task Force, key characteristics of the international trade system, including the enormous volume of trade flows, the complexity therein, can arise from the practice of commingling illicit funds with the cash flows of legitimate businesses and the limited recourse to verification procedures or programs to exchange customs data between countries have made it both attractive and vulnerable to illicit exploitation. A few years ago, my colleagues at FinCEN briefed me on an elaborate trade-based money laundering scheme that was linked to the terrorist organization Hezbollah. Under this scheme, the Lebanese Canadian Bank and multiple foreign exchange houses facilitated the laundering of South American drug proceeds through the Lebanese financial system. And through trade-based money laundering schemes involving used car and consumer goods, cars would be purchased in the U.S. and shipped to Senegal and other areas of West Africa. The proceeds from the car sales would be funneled back to Lebanon through bulk cash deposits among conspiring exchange houses. Now, as the chairman has noted, we are back at it again with the Lebanese Canadian Bank, and the same stream of illicit funding has been counted again. I note that Lou Brock and John Cassara suggest that a global network of trade transparency units would help us bring the opaque system used by Hezbollah and many others into the light of day, and I'm inclined to agree. The United States is already at the forefront of trade transparency. In 2004, the U.S. created the first trade transparency unit within the Department of Homeland Security to analyze data in order to identify global trade-based money laundering trends. A further expansion of TTUs would allow the U.S. to trade paperwork and set international standards for trade. And as our witnesses Lou Brock, John Cassara proposed, we need a system of TTUs that are analogous to the Egmont Group of Financial Intelligence Units. And I'm happy to see that Dr. Nikos Passas of Northeastern is with us today, and he recommends highly that we need to collect this data in one place so it can be easily analyzed. So in closing, I just appreciate the work of the chairman and vice chairman, the work of our witnesses as well. This is important work that needs to be addressed. I'd like to yield at this time 1 minute to the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Maxine Waters, for 1 minute.
First, I'd like to say that I'm pleased that our committee voted to extend the mandate of our task force to investigate terrorism financing for an additional 6 months. And I commend the good work of the task force, the work that they have done over the past year under the leadership of Ranking Member Lynch, Chairman Fitzpatrick, and Vice Chairman Pittenger. By providing the opportunity to hear from a wide range of experts, we've been able to better understand the threats we currently face, as well as the challenges we must meet in order to uncover the identities, intentions, and resources of fanatics who are plotting violence against innocent people, both here and abroad. I very much welcome the topic of today's hearing, and I look forward to this examination into the scope and dimension of trade-based money laundering and the threat it poses to our security. The written testimony of our witnesses makes an overwhelmingly persuasive case that trade-based money laundering is one of the most widespread, pernicious, and least understood forms of money laundering. Although the enormity of the problem may be daunting, I hope as we learn more about the issue, we'll be able to hone in and act on some discrete policy responses within our committee's jurisdiction, in particular, those that specifically address the role financial institutions play in detecting and disrupting trade-based money laundering schemes. I look forward to the witnesses' statements, and I yield back the balance of my time.
At this point, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield 1 minute to Ms. Sinema of Arizona.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick and Ranking Member Lynch. Arizona's top export market is Mexico, and cross-border trade is essential to our economy. Despite its importance to Arizona's economy, cross-border trade is often used to facilitate international money laundering. For the past 20 years, official figures put Mexican exports to America well above American imports from Mexico. According to Global Financial Integrity, the discrepancy can be attributed to Mexican groups using trade-based money laundering to bring dollars into Mexico. We need to find ways to stop trade-based money laundering while promoting the efficient and cost-effective movement of goods and services across borders. Given the volume and complex nature of trade-based money laundering, how can we do more to counter the misuse of international commerce and the threat it poses to our national security? How can we address this national security threat without limiting access to banking services for legitimate enterprises in border states like mine? I look forward to hearing more from our witnesses today about how we can better combat international money laundering without creating costly red tape that inhibits efficient commercial trade flows. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the Task Force, Mr. Pittenger, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick, and thank you to Chairman Henseling and Ranking Member Waters. Particularly want to thank Ranking Member Lynch of this task force for his continued dedication to these issues, and all the members who have committed their time and efforts to this important work. Thank you to the witnesses who've come and brought their experience to this committee. Trade-based money laundering is not a new concept, as criminal enterprises have relied on this method of illicit financing for years. However, many believe that this is an emerging technique now being used by terrorist groups to finance their violent and oppressive operations. With over $100 billion flowing into Iran, the world's largest state sponsor of terror, the risk of terror financing has never been greater. Similarly, the administration has done nothing to diminish the amount of ISIS soldiers on the battlefield in Iraq and Syria. ISIS numbers have remained consistently at 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers for the past several years, despite over 10,000 sortie airstrikes. Since we have not removed ISIS from the battlefield, they will continue to require resources to fund their oppression. As we enter into the new year, Congress should prioritize efforts to stop the flow of money and resources to terrorist organizations. We must ensure that organizations like the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network receive their resources and intelligence necessary to combat trade-based money laundering and other methods of illicit financing. With that, I do thank the chair and the ranking member once again, and I yield back.
And recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman Fitzpatrick. Thanks to all the witnesses today for your being here. As previous task force hearings have explored, the use of trade to launder money is nothing new and most definitely on the rise. Although trade-based money laundering is widely recognized as one of the most common ways terrorist organizations seek funding, it is my hope that this task force continues to explore solutions to an ever-growing problem that often hits too close to home. When I talk about that, I'm talking about my home. As a second-generation auto dealer, my industry has not been immune to trade-based money laundering. Through the sale of used cars as well as other legitimate products, terrorist organizations have funneled billions of dollars through U.S. markets. While many high-profile cases have been discussed in prior hearings, criminal organizations will continue to exploit new methods when it comes to laundering money, unless strict government oversight and enforcement is improved. It's my belief that the Congress and this task force have an important role to play in the combating of terrorist financing, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on how best to do it, especially on how my industry can do what they need to do to stop it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. We now welcome our witnesses. Mr. John Cassara is a former United States intelligence officer and Treasury special agent. Mr. Cassara has over 26 years of experience in the federal government intelligence and law enforcement communities. He's an expert in anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. Mr. Cassara invented the concept of trade transparency units and recently released a book on this topic this past fall entitled Trade-Based Money Laundering, The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement. Mr. Cassara has lectured around the world on a variety of transnational crime issues. He is currently an industry advisor to the analytics company SAS. He holds a master's degree in international management from the American Graduate School of International Management in Phoenix, Arizona. He also graduated magna cum laude from the University of California, San Diego. Louis Bach is a former senior special agent at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Mr. Bach has had a successful career as a U.S. government criminal investigator with experience targeting trade fraud and money laundering with the United States Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the Department of Agriculture, and the Drug Enforcement Agency. Mr. Bach was named the godfather of trade-based money laundering by Mr. Cassara in his recent book due to his pioneering efforts to systematize the analysis of trade data. Mr. Bach holds a bachelor's in behavioral and statistical measurement from Brooklyn College and a master's in education and behavioral statistical measurement from Keene College. Farley Mesko is co-founder and chief executive officer of Sayari Analytics. Mr. Mesko started after spending 5 years building the C4ADS, a nonprofit organization focused on data-driven technology-enabled analysis of conflict and security issues. Sayari Analytics conducts open-source resource of public records to uncover financial and other networks of illicit actors. Prior to his time at C4ADS, Mr. Mesko was a special correspondent for the East African magazine. Mr. Mesko holds a bachelor's in environmental studies and government from Bowdoin College. At this time, I'll ask Mr. Lynch to recognize and introduce his constituent from Northeastern University.
Thank you for that courtesy, Mr. Chairman. Nico Passis, professor of criminology and criminal justice at Northeastern University, one of our fine institutions in Boston, and is co-director of the Institute of Security and Public Policy. He has served as a corruption program director at Ethics and Compliance Officer Association and adjunct law professor at Case Western Reserve University. His law degree is from the University of Athens, his master's from the University of Paris, and his PhD is from the University of Edinburgh Faculty of Law. He specializes in the study of corruption, illicit financial trade flows, sanctions, informal fund transfers, remittances, terrorism, white-collar crime, financial regulation, organized crime, and international crimes. He has published more than 200 articles, books, chapters, reports, and books in 13 languages. His next book is entitled Trade-Based Financial Crime and Illicit Flows, and another entitled Corruption and Crisis in Greece. So welcome, Dr. Passos.
The witnesses will now be recognized for 5 minutes each to give an oral presentation of your testimony. Without objection, the witnesses' written statements will be made a part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the task force will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions. For the witnesses on your table are 3 lights, green, yellow, and red. Yellow means you have 1 minute remaining. Red obviously means your time is up. Be advised that the microphone is very sensitive, so please make sure you're speaking directly into that. With that, Mr. Casari, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, and members of the task force, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It is an honor for me to be here. Not long after the September 11th attacks, I had a conversation with a Pakistani entrepreneur. This businessman could charitably be described as being involved in international gray markets and illicit finance. We discussed many of the subjects addressed in this hearing, including trade-based money laundering, terror finance, value transfer, hawala, fictitious invoicing, countervaluation, and others. At the end of the discussion, he looked at me and he said, quote, "Mr. John, don't you know that your adversaries are transferring money and value right under your noses, but the West doesn't see it. Your enemies are laughing at you." That businessman knew that the U.S. and the international community have devoted attention, countermeasures, and resources to counter a variety of money laundering and terror finance methodologies. However, trade-based money laundering, for the most part, has been ignored. TBML is defined as the process of disguising the proceeds of crime and moving value through the use of trade transactions in an attempt to legitimize their illicit origins. The key word in that definition is value. The magnitude of TBML has never been systematically examined. Nevertheless, one academic study examining the 2013 U.S. trade data found that almost $220 billion of illicit value was moved out of the United States in the form of value transfer. That figure represents almost 6% of U.S. trade. Approximately $340 billion was moved into the country via suspect trade transactions, representing about 9% of U.S. trade. TBML is also involved with tax evasion, export incentive fraud, VAT fraud, capital flight or the transfer of wealth offshore, evading capital controls, barter trade, underground financial systems such as Faiqian, the Chinese flying money system, the black market peso exchange, and commercial trade-based money laundering such as trade diversion, transfer pricing, and abusive trade misinvoicing. In discussing terror finance, TBML is also intertwined with hawala, the misuse of the Afghan transit trade, Iran-Dubai commercial connections, the tri-border region in South America, suspect international Lebanese Hezbollah trading syndicates, non-bank lawless regimes such as those in Somalia and Libya, and the ISIS regime in Syria and Iraq, and many more. So considering all of its varied forms, I can make the argument that trade-based money laundering is perhaps the largest and most pervasive money laundering methodology in the world. Unfortunately, it is also the least understood, recognized, and enforced. In its primary form, TBML revolves around invoice fraud and the associated manipulation of supporting documents. The primary techniques are over and under invoicing of goods, multiple invoicing of goods, and falsely described goods. For example, Do you know that we are importing plastic buckets from the Czech Republic and each bucket costs $972? Do you know that we are importing toilet tissue from China at the price of over $4,000 a kilogram, and that we are exporting live cattle to Mexico at $20 a head? Because of the magnitude of U.S. and global merchandise trade, these transactions and millions of others like them are not recognized and simply get commingled. Successful enforcement efforts are practically nil. Nevertheless, I am hopeful. First of all, theoretically, international trade transparency can be achieved because of the exponential growth in data and the incredible advances in analytics. I'm also optimistic because trade transparency is also a revenue enhancer. I have found that the carrot of empowering our partners to strive for trade transparency and increased revenue can be much more effective than the stick of heavy-handed measures that have proved unsuccessful. I have a number of recommendations in my written statement and in my new book, Trade-Based Money Laundering, The Next Frontier in International Money Laundering Enforcement. These include reaching a consensus on the magnitude of the problem, a financial action task force recommendation on TBML, and supporting the Trade Transparency Unit initiative. Thank you, and I would be very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Cassara. Mr. Bach, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'd also like to thank the chairman and the committee for this opportunity. I appreciate your interest in the program that I've helped to develop for the past 25 years. I'm Lou Bach. I'm a retired senior special agent who worked as an investigator with DEA and USDA. Later at Customs, which later became ICE and DHS, I worked and supervised financial, fraud, and intelligence programs. For much of my career, I generated and worked large, complicated criminal cases involving trade fraud, money laundering schemes totaling billions of dollars. I did so with the help of a team of import and tax specialists, agents, and analysts. We identified patterns of criminal behavior that stretched across large volumes of trade and financial data. The software and methodology that my team and I pioneered was successfully deployed in over 24 countries. This led, with the insight and vision of John Cassara, to the development of trade transparency units. I believe that the TTUs have veered from its initial financial and customs focus, in part because of the changing culture within the Department of DHS. Cassara writes in his book, Trade-Based Money Laundering, the forced merger with the former INS and expansion of customs mission into immigration enforcement has not been successful. Its expertise, skill sets, budgets, and staffing were diluted. The resulting dysfunction within the DHS has been well documented. DHS has neither the customs nor financial expertise to make the TTU a success. The loser here is our ability to tackle trade-based money laundering and trade and tax revenue loss on a grand scale. It's a missed opportunity to target funds flowing to terrorist groups such as ISIS, which necessarily do participate in global trade. What is needed in support of a TTU? Detailed transactional import and export data, as well as records of the movement of money for the United States and partner nations. Movement of trade goods should include bills of lading and manifest records for both imports and exports of the United States. Intermediate container movements, which are already available, are also useful. BSA data includes suspicious activity reports will greatly enhance the targeting capacity of the items mentioned above. At present, the existing DHS TTU's attention is focused 90% on South America. That perhaps made some sense given that DHS's focus is on immigration and drugs. I believe this view does little to attack current evolving terrorist threats. The real money flowing to ISIS involves trade from the Middle East, Europe, and including Turkey. With a proper focus on terrorist financing and trade-based money laundering housed in a financial organization such as FinCEN, who has existing agreements with revenue agencies, we could make a serious dent in the core funding sources of entities such as ISIS. I recommend the creation of an reinvigorated TTU with an associated budget line from Customs. I also think that a TTU should be housed at FinCEN under Treasury. Treasury is an agency capable of addressing the nexus of trade-based money laundering and tax revenue loss within the existing international agreements. I believe DHS, ICE, is not a revenue agency, and the Treasury Department is. Giving FinCEN this focus immediately and full access to the necessary trade data is the obvious next step, whatever the eventual status of the TTU initiative is within DHS. Let's return to our earlier vision, focus, and effectiveness built on a rapidly increasing number of TTUs analogous to the Egmont Group of financial intelligence units. I'd like to get back on track with this, and thank you for listening.
Mr. Mesko, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Fitzpatrick, Ranking Member Lynch, members of the task force, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I want to dive deeper into the real-world example of Hezbollah terror financing through TBML that was referenced in the opening statements by the members. And I want to do so in order to illustrate some of the challenges and opportunities in targeting these schemes. 2011, as part of a larger sanctions package, U.S. regulators and law enforcement identified a Cotonou, Benin-based group of import-export companies known as the Elissa Group. It dealt primarily in used car imports into West Africa from the United States, Canada, and Europe. Treasury data from the original 2011 action indicates that at least 6 of the sanctioned companies shared an address in Cotonou. Several also shared the same phone number and key personnel. We went to the public records in the Chamber of Commerce in Cotonou and Benin and found that another company co-located with the Elissa Group at the time of the original 2011 designation was Remighty SRL. And further, that a new company, Abu Mary Lines, began to use the same shared address and phone number shortly after the 2011 sanctions designation. It took 2 more years to identify Remighty SRL as a participant in the original scheme, and in 2013 FinCEN 311 designation. And it took another 2 years on top of that to identify and sanction Abu Mary Lines in 2015. These entities were operating for years out of the same location in Benin, with the same address, the same phone number by the same key people. What I haven't mentioned so far is that in addition to Remighty SRL and Abu Mary Lines, public data shows that at least 5 other companies and 2 individuals were and possibly continue to be active at the shared Elissa Group address in Benin, some cases listed care of Elissa Group on their public documents and operating in the used vehicle trade. And I shared this example because it illustrates several key points about detecting and deterring trade-based money laundering. First, that sanctions, 311 actions, and indictments are a starting point and not an end point in the government's efforts to target money launderers and terror financiers. Networks change over time, but they rarely go away, and TBML networks in particular often leave a large footprint of companies and individuals as a result of their efforts to seem legitimate. Working in our favor, more often than not, there's a trail leading back from these seemingly legitimate entities to already known and already identified illicit actors. The data to help us draw these connections is often publicly available. It may not be easy to find, but it is out there. Working against us, however, is the fact that the types of relationships that we should be concerned about within a network don't always comport with the types of relationships that regulators have told banks, insurance companies, transportation sector that they need to be concerned about. And this is an area where I think the task force could have real impact. And the clearest example in my mind is that of the singular focus on majority ownership by Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control when they guide financial institutions in their dealings with related parties to specially designated nationals, such as those identified as part of the Elissa Group sanctions package. OFAC has stated that banks need only block transactions related to parties owned 50% or more by an SDN, but only, quote, urges caution when dealing with parties where an SDN has a significant minority interest or may exercise control by means other than majority ownership. Never mind the lack of clarity on what regulators mean in practical terms when they urge caution, but what about an entity in a terror financing network that is 49% owned by a narco trafficker working with Hezbollah? What about entities that share key personnel, identifiers, and selectors with a group of SDNs and operate in the same industry segment in the same place as those SDNs? Do we really want to allow financial institutions, transportation companies, insurance brokers, whoever it is, to service these clients? It strikes me that especially in the terror financing context, and duly true in the case of the complex webs of relationships that characterize TBML, clarifying and expanding the scope of what the private sector needs to be concerned about is long overdue. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Mesko. Professor Passos, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. Chairman Fitzpatrick, Congressman Lynch, thank you for the kind introduction. Vice Chairman Pittenger, distinguished members of the task force, it is an honor to testify before you. The threat of trade-based money laundering is serious, but effective responses are feasible and within reach. The switch to turn the lights on to what is now shadowy economic activities is in your hands. I will list the challenges and outline some solutions. Despite substantial efforts against money laundering, too little attention is paid to trade, which constitutes the biggest security and crime liability, a black hole undermining the entire control framework. Even if all current rules were ever to be perfectly enforced throughout the world, billions of dirty funds could still be moved undetected. Trade can hide both illegal shipments and illicit finance. Countering the finance of terrorism is about financial vigilance to understand the operations of terror groups, to respond effectively and strategically. For this, financial, information, and commercial flows must be monitored. Most of our attention focuses on the first two, while trade is neglected and wide open to abuse. Many terror groups have used commodities for finance, including ISIS. Some work was done in 2003 at FinCEN on trade-connected Hawala and other informal value transfer systems, a term I coined back in the 90s, but no proper assessment of trade vulnerabilities or updated Hawala review has taken place. When it comes to trillions of dollars in annual trade, our vision is blurred. Relevant information is scattered. Some of it is collected by customs, FinCEN, commerce, port authorities, and counterparts overseas. Other data are in the hands of banks, insurance companies, logistics companies, importers, exporters, and no one has the full picture because no one aggregates the data in one place. Banks are expected to focus on transactions and check-the-box monitoring that yields massive false positives rather than centering on the highest risks, identifying offenders, and working more closely with controllers. Finally, the value of open source information helpful for investigations and due diligence relative to criminal networks, beneficial ownership, adverse news, corruption is underestimated. Yet it can point to knowledge gaps, misunderstandings, and new insights. The answer is to stop missing opportunities. The necessary data are not in one place, but do exist. Hawala is a challenge, but also an intelligence resource because intermediaries can help. Agencies should share information. Businesses and academia can assist with new data collection and policy useful analysis. Our view is blurred unnecessarily. It is like having a 4K TV that we use for analog programs. The means are there to create a feed for high-definition picture of illicit trade and finance. Several data types can be assembled. Inbound and outbound manifests on what goods are received, where, when, and who's involved. Import and export declarations when goods enter or leave the economy. Some of it is published online, some provided by companies for a fee. Business documents, BSA, trade finance, insurance, storage, crime, medical, satellite imaging, and cash movement data can be added too. Concrete steps the U.S. government should consider include the following. Ensure that government data are gathered and analyzed in one place. FinCEN could be ideal. Assemble private and open source data through a trusted third party such as a university that securely stores and analyzes them in a consolidated way, collaborates with FinCEN to identify irregularities, generate typologies and red flags, map criminal networks, issue guidance, and produce evidence-based investigative clues. Update information on Hawala in the US and regions of concerns. Methods keep changing and adapting. We need to know what changed. None of this is new. At Northeastern, we collaborated with FinCEN, DHS, and IJ to do exactly that kind of work on hawala, gold, diamonds, and tobacco trade. Working with the Arizona Attorney General, we combined MSB and trade data for a case laundering through textiles in the US, Mexico, and China. Partners in Europe and the Middle East stand ready to be enlisted in a collective action targeting, for example, ISIS, a group with enemies in and around the territory controls. Instead of shooting in the dark, we can shed light on black markets and go after well-defined targets. Official networks, records, networks to produce new data, technology, analytical capacity, experience and willingness to collaborate are all there. I urge you to turn the switch. Thank you.
We thank the witnesses for their testimony. We'll now go to members of the task force for 5 minutes of questions each. Recognize myself. Mr. Bach, given your longstanding experience in seeking to uncover trade-based money laundering schemes, are you satisfied with the United States government's efforts since the 1990s to uncover and ultimately dismantle this type of illicit activity? And obviously, you know, we know that there have been some great successes, but we're most interested in where you think the United States government can do better.
When the effort is made to collect the data and organize it and analyze it, lots of material is created. The biggest problem I have seen in my experience with both the Customs Service and with DHS was that once you found something, you had difficulty bringing it to people who were interested in making the cases. With the priorities out in the field, it was easier for the agents in charge to have arrests made for small quantities of dope or for illegal aliens. The cases that we came across, such as gold, it's mind-staggering how much money moves there and the amount of things that look good, that confuses people. And as a result, it needs lots of resources to make the cases. And that's something that the field is not very often interested in doing. And that's our biggest problem. This case you had in the papers today with DEA is a large case. There wasn't a lot of energy in the field to make cases like this. That's my biggest complaint, and we had a difficult time of getting it out to the field.
On the issue of information sharing between agencies, we can think back to the 9/11 Commission. One of the big criticisms of our intelligence agencies is that they were doing individually a pretty good job in a stovepipe setting, but they weren't sharing information with each other. Mr. Bach, how would you grade the cooperation between law enforcement and the other federal agencies, Customs, Border Protection, ICE, Financial Crimes Enforcement Network? Are they sharing information with each other, and is there opportunity for improvement there?
Yes, they are sharing the information. The financial networks are part of the system that we were using in the trade transparency units within DHS. However, it's difficult to get things, I have to be careful with this, the things that come from the atmosphere that are captured, it's difficult to get that information put into a report to identify and say, here's some further evidence. It's one thing to say we see a massive trade flow problem. There's unbelievable amounts of gold coming from a country that doesn't have it. It's another thing to have somebody tell you, we know where the bank accounts are, and we know of people making these transactions, and then not being able to tell anybody about it. So that, in my experience, has been the biggest problem. I think that would have convinced many people to take the cases.
Mr. Cassara, well, you say it's logical that the early trade transparency units, they were sort of originating in and around Latin America. What was a little surprising is there was not a movement of those TTUs beyond that region. Why do you think that that was the case?
I think originally when the TTUs were first stood up, back about 2004, 2005, it made sense to kind of focus on Latin America in general. They were specifically concerned about the black market peso exchange methodology, and this was considered one of the primary countermeasures that we had. The concept, in fact, has proven successful. We have about a dozen TTUs right now. There have been about $1 billion of seizures, okay? But at the same time, it's like operating with one hand tied behind your back, because the system has never really had, has never really accelerated, has never reached that next level. And there's a lot of reasons behind that we could get into, but a lot of it has to do with lack of resources, lack of personnel, rating of personnel and resources, et cetera. There have been countries around the world that have wanted to create TTUs. In fact, that was the original concept behind the TTUs, is to have an Egmont-like financial intelligence umbrella for trade transparency units. I still think that's feasible. I think that is the next frontier in international money laundering enforcement. I think we will be moving in that direction, but we can't continue the status quo. We're just treading water, and I think we need to get to the next level. It's certainly attainable. We just have to have the will to do it. And as I keep harking back in my testimony, this should be a no-brainer. We can do that. The data exists, and it's a revenue enhancer. Why wouldn't we want to do it?
Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several of the witnesses today have mentioned the fact that we have deployed a lot of anti-terrorist financing assets. We have them in ICE, we have them at Treasury and FinCEN, but they're somewhat scattered. And I know Mr. Bach and Dr. Passos, you've both mentioned that more properly the resources should be deployed at FinCEN because it's a revenue agency, part of Treasury. They're doing a great job on the FIUs. Members of this task force and committee were involved very early on when we were standing up FIUs in Afghanistan and Jordan and Morocco. Is it the general feeling of the panel that should take place? Mr. Cassara?
I spent 6 years of my life at FinCEN. I was a customs liaison to FinCEN. This was in the late 1990s and in the era around 9/11.
I don't have a lot of time. I'm just trying to get an assessment of whether you think that's a good idea or a bad idea.
My personal opinion is no, it's not a good idea. The TTU belongs in what is customs, and a lot of this has to do with customs agreements we reach with other countries. The other thing is we can debate FinCEN, but in my opinion, FinCEN has never achieved its full potential, and there's a host of issues over there right now. I don't think they're ready for the TTU.
Okay, Mr. Bach?
I think you can look at Colombia. OEF is their FIU, and they're spectacularly successful with what they're doing. They've taken some of the information all the way back for 14 years ago when we gave them to it, and they're working on the gold cases now. Even as we speak, they're making the cases. So,
all right. Mr. Mesko, you got an opinion on this?
I'll defer to my colleagues on where this thing should be housed, but I think what I would say is that I would encourage whatever form it takes to properly include open source data and better integration with the private sector.
Okay, fair enough. Dr. Passos?
I agree that it has to be the same place. With customs, it hasn't worked as well as it could. The advantage of FinCEN is that you have the Egmont Group and a network for collaborations with sister agencies overseas. Yeah. So this kind of consolidation is easier.
Okay. My next question, when we stood up these FIUs, we initially had resistance from some of the banks because we were asking for cash transaction reports. We were asking for STRs, those suspicious transaction reports. A lot of paperwork for the banks. And, in the early days, we weren't really set up to process all that, so some of it was a waste. Are we getting pushback? Look, I represent the Port of Boston, and we get a lot of bulk cargo coming in there. We're not Long Beach. We're not Manhattan and New Jersey, but we've got a lot of cargo coming in. Should I expect pushback? Should the committee expect pushback from the shipping community in terms of trying to put this overlay of analysis on everything that they're doing? Have we experienced that? I mean, we've got some of these set up. Have we experienced pushback from our shipping consortiums and here and overseas?
If I can answer that, I believe that they would be very much wanting to give us the data. It's been my experience after 9/11, Commissioner Bonner demanded the information, and they gave it to us willingly.
Yeah.
Now, it is a problem. It's very large, and
Yeah.
it needs resources to process the data. But they're not against giving it. It's something that they transmit constantly.
Certainly, it would shield them from some liability if they were cooperating with us.
I believe that's true, but they would need a little bit of protection on their own, because you can find lots of little things they do wrong.
Yeah.
And that's their main concern, that a lot of gotchas.
I see, yeah. Dr. Passos?
The private sector does not want to deal with terrorists or financiers. So the general will is there. The data are collected, is no new cost for them to add it, and consolidating the risk management is a cost saver.
Okay, all right. My time's just about expired. Thank you. I yield back.
Recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there any reason why the data could not be shared with Customs and with FinCEN in a joint effort in collaboration? Mr. Bach?
No, the data belongs to FinCEN and to Treasury. To have it not been given back, I mean, these are collection documents that are used to collect taxes and duties. They actually belong to Treasury. To hold them from FinCEN is kind of silly.
Ms. Kassar, any more comment on that?
Approximately 2004-ish, 2005, right when the TTU was being stood up, there was a delegation that went over to FinCEN, and what we tried to do at the time was to co-locate the TTU with the FIU, because that, as Lou has made perfectly clear, is the ideal. But FinCEN at the time turned it down. They did not want any part of it.
Thank you. There's been some criticism regarding the lack of robust intelligence support on ground in the Middle East. What would you do to enhance that, to effectively address trade-based money laundering?
The difficulty isn't that they will share it. They make it available, but you have to have such a high clearance to get to it. And then once you find the material, it's an arduous process to get it downgraded to the point where you can use it in the field. I don't know, I'm not that expert in that field, but I can tell you I found really good stuff there. I just couldn't give it to anybody.
Yes, sir.
I've done a lot of training, technical assistance, mentoring in the Middle East, and what I have found is that in most countries of the world, customs services are not follow the U.S. model. They are not enforcement-oriented. They're involved with, say, inspection and control, right? So when they find something that perhaps is suspicious, they're content to, say, maybe collect a duty and all this other things, but they don't hand it off to an investigative body. There's a lack of capacity, a lack of training as well. There's corruption issues involved. It's not a simple formula, but if you can make the right connections, there are things that can be done. And the other thing I get back to, again, it's a revenue enhancer. So this should be the carrot to drive their cooperation.
Thank you. Dr. Passos?
Yeah, this is one of the additional reasons why open source data is a good thing to look at. Sometimes the news and the information is in the local newspaper. It may be in another language, but there is easy, accessible technology to get that so that everybody can read the local newspaper and put it together.
Very good. As we've discussed, the Edgemont Group and its working through the trade transparency units and enhancing that, what obstacles do you see going forward to overcome with this information sharing prototype? If we were to try to advance that further, what should we be looking out for?
Using, again, the example in Colombia, in order to get around this, we actually set up 2 units. We had a unit with Dion, which is their treasury, and as a customs officer, I was able to communicate directly with Dion. Dion wasn't the law enforcement agency. The UEF was their FIU, and UEF is the one that's prosecuting these cases, to my understanding at this point, okay? So it was a small thing to have 2 operations set up. But the 2 operations in Colombia don't talk to each other. But it was okay because we were talking to both of them.
Very good. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Waters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I have a number of questions I'd like to get some clarification on. And I suppose the big question for, I guess, both Mr. Brock and Mr. Cassara is, do you believe action should be taken to require the disclosure of beneficial ownership information upon incorporation and to require financial institutions to check that information against lists of known terrorists and those who are known to finance terrorism before new accounts can be opened on their behalf?
As a criminal investigator, yes, we should require beneficial ownership information, not only because it's the right. Obviously, if we're trying to follow the money and value trails, there's a labyrinth of hidden financial networks, and without beneficial ownership information, it makes it very, very difficult to follow those trails. The other thing I would like to bring to the committee's attention, or the task force's attention, is because, again, I have done work overseas, and time again, I have been asked by our counterparts overseas, but Mr. John, I'm following the dirty money trail from my country, and it leads to your country. Have you ever heard of this place called Delaware or Nevada or Wyoming? Can you please help us get information? And there's nothing we can do. It is embarrassing. Thank you.
Mr. Brock?
That's not my area of expertise. I handle documents and things and computer operations. I can't answer that.
Would anyone else like to share information or thoughts on that? If not, let me just ask a very basic question. I thought that know your customer in banking really meant know your customer, which means that you would know who the people are, you would have disclosure of beneficial ownership, on and on and on. Am I incorrect in thinking that know your customer should mean all of that?
It's good to remember that the due diligence and the idea of know your customer came from the private sector at the beginning. It was the Wolfsburg Group that identified that as a problem for their own business. You don't want to give money to someone you do not know. You do not want to do business with someone you do not know. So that's something for self-protection and for their bottom line. Private entities will do and do. The question is how much detail and are you going to do that with the partners of the partners, and how are you going to handle corresponding relations and things overseas? And that is where the details need to be worked out on what gets outsourced to the private sector and what is the duty for guidance on the part of the authorities. When the authorities give good guidance, fantastic results can come when you have targeted action on the part of the banks. But when the general culture is go out and check for everything, then we get a sea of data that we have a hard time analyzing from the government side.
Well, let me just say that without even dealing with the issue of terrorism and just money laundering, for example, we've been in this discussion for many, many years. I can recall the discussions we had about Mexico and about the fact that banks were basically serving as private bankers for drug dealers coming out of Mexico some years ago. I don't know what's going on now. And we talked a lot about making the financial institutions a lot more responsible. And it was not just Mexico, it was Africa, and it was a lot of other places. All of that discussion seems to have been lost, and it's not a part of the discussion as we deal with terrorism. And so I hear some of the recommendations, I wonder about them, but I'm going to continue to listen and leave you with this thought for Mr. Bach, or for those of you who are talking about expanding the role of FinCEN. I've often wondered if FinCEN wasn't always overloaded, always with too much responsibility for looking at everything from $10,000, over $10,000 a transaction, which, I mean, just comes in by the boatloads and other kinds of things? And would they really be able to deal with what now we're focusing on, trying to focus on, terrorism and money laundering through trade?
When I was back right after 9/11, I worked with FinCEN for 3-4 years. We worked on Hawala as well as diamonds, gold, tobacco, and a number of other items. The problem was that there weren't enough resources to focus on everything. It is a question of resources. It is a question of how many analysts you're going to have, how many people will do meetings, how many people will do analysis, how many people will do the liaising with the agencies that need to investigate. So once you get down to that and you give the guidance, then you can get better results.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank the panelists for being here. Over the several months that we've had this task force and we've had our hearings, we've learned of various sources of funding for terrorism financing. There's been the black market, there's prostitution, human trafficking, just theft, and now we're looking at trade-based money laundering. This is a general question to the panel. What is the most common form of trade-based money laundering that's out there today that is benefiting the terrorist organizations? Whomever.
Therefore, misinvoicing, you misdeclare the destination, the value, or the quantity of a product. Cargo theft, counterfeiting, and trade diversion.
Anybody, Mr. Cassera?
As a follow-up to that, I'd like to add that, in my opinion, the commodity of choice for trade-based money laundering is now and has been for a long time is gold, the misuse of the international gold trade. Just to give you a very, very quick visual.
It was exempt, wasn't it? I mean, as a form of currency from some of the sanctions.
It's both. Gold has unique properties. It's both a commodity and a negotiable instrument, if you will. There are couriers every day, for example, that travel from Milan's Malpensa airport to, say, Karachi, Dubai, and they declare gold. And they declare this gold is $500,000 worth of gold, and they have all the documentation. But is that 18-karat Italian gold chain?
Right.
Is that 24-karat Saudi gold or Indian gold? Is it 12-karat Walmart special? Is it 500,000, 50,000, or 750,000? That's the way trade-based money laundering works.
And how do we track that? Through the TTUs, or can you do it through the TTUs?
A TTU can spot anomalies in the data.
Right.
Then what is required is you have to write a report, and the report has to be given to an agent, a customs agent, or a
and it's only as good as the relationship.
And then somebody has to do an investigation.
Right, and I guess my concern is first of all, we're just released over $100 billion in assets to the central bank of terrorism, which is Tehran. We know that they give money to terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas, and to that down to the Houthis. We feel confident they're going to continue to do this even at a greater level. How do we prevent, or at least be able to follow through TTUs if necessary? Is that what we're going to need with are we ever going to get them with Iran? I mean, how do we go about now making sure that trade-based money laundering isn't becoming a predominant factor in a source of funds with Iran?
I mean, one thing that I think I can offer here is, as we just heard from Mr. Cassara, the typologies of trade-based money laundering are notoriously difficult to detect.
Right.
Right? Which, for someone from my perspective, means that we should be focused not just on typologies, but on the actual networks. The data to help us map these networks and these relationships is far more easy to access.
And that's done through the TTUs, as I understand it, correct?
Whether it's the TTUs, or whether it's the financial sector, or whether it's the transportation sector, they all have pieces of the puzzle to bring to the table.
With Lou Bock, actually, in an afternoon, we sat down, we found hundreds of millions of dollars of irregularities that we passed on and nobody acted on. You could see diamonds, rough diamonds, coming from countries that don't have mines. You could see brokers declaring themselves as importers of record. You could see the value disparity is huge, so misinvoicing was massive. When you have these things, these are obvious. You put it together with the networks and the open source information, and no matter what you call it, the entity that has all the information together can turn the lights on.
And that's the point I think that I want to get at here is regardless of how well we can do in tracking, including the relationships that we have with our trading partners through TTUs, and Mr. Cassera, you hit upon this in your opening statement, it's all about enforcement. Prosecutorial discretion, whomever it may be. Mr. Bach, as you explained when dealing with Colombia, one side doesn't speak to the other side, but at least they're speaking to us. But when it comes time to find where the source is, what do? Is not enforcement probably the biggest hurdle that we have to overcome? And how do we go about enforcing? Mr. Cassera.
It's a real challenge, but I want to emphasize what you just said. It all comes down to enforcement. We can pass all the rules, regulations, laws in the world, but it comes down to enforcement. And the other thing I'd like to drive home for those of you that are concerned about areas of the world where our adversaries operate, in the United States, we have the best, most robust customs enforcement in the world. We have the best data in the world. We have the best analytics in the world. We have the most motivated staff in the world. And we're doing a horrible job.
It's like rules of engagement.
Right.
We're not able to engage.
So if you
even
look
though we got somebody from Treasury in Qatar, we're still not able to do anything about it.
Exactly. So look at where our adversaries are in the Middle East, South Asia, and other places in Latin America and whatnot, and it's not happening.
I agree. And I appreciate y'all's testimony. My time has expired. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There was some mention of stovepiping, and I want to say a few words in defense of stovepiping, because back in the old days it used to be called need-to-know basis. After 9/11, we decided that we needed to connect the dots, and so everybody in the intel community got to see all the dots. And Bradley Manning got to see all the dots, and he told the world about all the dots. So we need a balance of letting people in the Intel Committee see the dots and protecting our dots of information. I think that there are people at Treasury that have done an outstanding job on terrorist financing, but there are aspects where we're just not serious. The witnesses have brought some of that to our attention. Outside the realm of this task force, I'd point out that, perhaps this has changed recently, but our policy used to be that we didn't bomb oil tankers hauling ISIS oil because the drivers might be civilian. Had we refused to bomb Nazi trains during World War II because the conductor was a civilian, we might live in a very different world today. And also, I don't see why they're using trade when our IRS allows you to get a tax deduction for giving money to terrorist organizations. I brought to the IRS's attention 5 years ago a group that was funding Viva Palestina and Hamas, gave them the videotape, and as of now, the only indication that anything has happened is that the organization itself puts on its website, the IRS may eventually take away our tax-exempt status, and implies you ought to give money to them now so that you can get your money to Hamas and get your tax deduction. So there's a certain lack of seriousness in some parts of Treasury, the IRS. Mr. Cassandra, you talked about not showing beneficial ownership, that Wyoming and Delaware. How big a problem is this, and should we simply have a federal statute that says if you form an entity anywhere in America that makes use of interstate commerce, that's engaged with our interstate banking system, you have to disclose beneficial ownership in publicly available state or federal records? Or how are we going to criticize the Cayman Islands if we got Delaware? Mr. Cassandra. And how helpful would it be to know that the beneficial ownership of the entities involved in business and trade?
It would be extremely beneficial for law enforcement to have beneficial ownership information. I am certainly not an attorney. I'm not a legislator. I couldn't attempt to even craft the appropriate language, but all I can say is the system as it operates now is not working, and yes, it is hypocritical because we are quick to criticize others, and we have to look at ourselves in the mirror when it comes to beneficial ownership information.
How big a problem are the tax havens? They're not just tax havens, they're transparency havens. We could prohibit U.S. banks from doing business for those countries that act as tax havens and shield beneficial ownership information. How how useful would it be if every one of these tax havens, in fact, was cooperating with us at least as much as say, Britain, as an example? Mr. Block.
One of the problems that, in my opinion, spawned the black market peso exchange was Colombia's effort to control their currency. Early on in the 90s, they wanted all transactions to be funded through banks. The banks then reported who were doing the imports and the exports. That's what spawned the black market peso exchange. It's called counter trade. People who had legitimate money in the United States, selling coffee and things that they sent to the United States, had a surplus of money in the United States. It was natural for some people who needed tractors in the United States, say, give me that money and I'll pay for the tractors. Perfectly legitimate. We drove people with the legislation away from the banks. And that black market peso you can't follow anyway, except for one good thing. When it's black market peso funded, they usually smuggle it into the country. That's an easy way to find black market peso. But
You say they smuggle the currency or they smuggle the goods?
the goods.
Gotcha.
Because the goods enjoy a benefit. They're not reported to Dion. The banks report to Dion what goods are coming in.
So if you want to avoid customs, you take money that has been moved to the United States to avoid Colombian taxes or scrutiny or currency controls.
That's correct.
Then you also get to avoid the customs as well if you can smuggle the goods.
Yes,
and
and on top-
Sandra, I know, wants to say something, and other than that, will yield.
I just want to follow up on what Lou Bach said. This concept of countervaluation is extremely important to understand because it is the common denominator for most underground financial systems, alternative remittance systems in the world, whether, again, it be Hawala, misused by terrorists, or Chinese flying money systems. It's this concept of countervaluation or balancing the books through value transfer, through value in one country being shifted, if you will, through over and under invoicing sometimes and other methods to another country. So if we want to get at these underground financial systems abused by our adversaries, we need to promote trade transparency.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Cassara, I think you said that every TPP signatory country should establish a trade transparency unit so that countries can share data and help combat trade fraud. So one of my questions is, how do you think other countries involved in TPP would respond to a request like this?
Again, in my statement, I said I don't have a position on the pros and cons of the TPP, but I am quite certain that if the TPP and other international trade initiatives of that type, they will promote trade, and what happens is the misuse of trade gets lost in the noise. So I think what would be beneficial to all countries is to have true trade transparency. And I think they will actually be willing participants because I go back again, because it is a revenue enhancer and it cracks down on trade fraud.
So you don't think it'd be a deal breaker?
I do not.
Okay, good. Mr. Mesko, in your testimony, you talked about an example of trade-based money laundering that I stated earlier that is personal to me. In fact, I've had the pleasure of discussing this case in great detail with your colleague, David Asher, who has also testified before this task force. I guess what struck me most from the conversation I had with Mr. Asher was that some of the comments you've made today is how obvious the entire scheme was or seemed to be. For example, Dr. Asher showed me aerial shots of what they were bringing the used cars in and how over a short period of time they grew larger and larger. Now, as you stated in October of last year, another company was sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury for alleged participation in the same trade-based money laundering scheme identified in 2011 involving used cars. That is almost 4 years after the original scheme was discovered. So the scheme seemed to go on for years and years without any action being taken. So one of my questions is that normal? Is it routine for the names to change and the businesses to go on operating?
Yeah, I think it is absolutely normal, and it just shows that all it takes is incremental adjustments to the networks for these schemes to continue to operate. Now, what I do want to say, though, is that I don't want to fault law enforcement or regulators necessarily for the time it takes to build cases. What I think is potentially more important here is that in order to get law enforcement and regulators the best intelligence, and particularly the best financial intelligence available from the financial sector, from the transportation sector, from insurance, wherever it may come from, there needs to be a better focus on intelligence, true intelligence within those institutions, and knowing how to use data to better target the people that we really care about, that we know we care about, rather than the, mom and pop money laundering, the $10,000 in structured cash deposits here and there, which sort of dominates the anti-money laundering space within financial institutions.
Is the U.S. government not providing adequate resources to, what would you?
I can only really speak from the position of the financial sector at this point.
Okay. Is it all about resources, or does Congress need to give more authority in this space?
I think one thing that could be potentially very useful, and I think that it's been discussed several times here today, we've talked a lot about the question of stovepiping on the government side, but within financial institutions and between financial institutions, there's a tremendous amount of this stovepiping as well. A local regional branch, say, of a money center bank that operates in Mexico has a tremendous difficulty sharing information on, adverse information on clients or customers with global headquarters, whether that's in New York or London or wherever. In between, that's to say nothing of banks sharing information in between different institutions. So I think that one way that this task force could have a tremendous impact is clarifying the guidance on what is, at least at the very least in the United States, what information banks can share with each other on the compliance side. They do it every second of every day on the commercial side. That's how the global economy works. But there's very, very little information sharing on the compliance side.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, one thing that you may want to think a little bit about is realigning the thinking between regulators and law enforcement on our side, because the regulators want the banks to do what they're doing now, which is the massive transaction monitoring, whereas the law enforcement want to concentrate on targets. When we concentrate on targets, we get better results, much more focused. We did that with child pornography. We did that with human trafficking. Much better results there, much better use of the private sector in that respect.
Got just a little bit of time here real quick. We've heard lots of numbers. What's the number going between on used car sales that we're sending back and forth? What would that number be? $1 billion?
At the high end, hundreds of millions.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank you and the ranking member for the service that you're rendering in hosting these hearings. I'd also like to thank the witnesses for appearing today and make one observation. Looking and judging your body language, you're all very resolute. You really have come to conclusions that you absolutely believe in. So I want to just compliment you on being so strong-willed, if you will, with reference to what you say. Now, I will tell you, when I heard $972 for a plastic bucket, that got my attention. My question to you, sir, is this commonplace, a rarity? Because I understand what you mean about the value transfer. How frequent do we have these occurrences of buckets or cattle for $20? You did say cattle for $20. I'm from Texas. From time to time, I wear a big hat, but I have no cattle. In Texas, that means you're really not very much of a cowboy or rancher. But when you tell me that you're selling cattle for $20, even I understand that there's a problem. So how is it that you're able to acquire this intelligence? And I'm not sure whether you're implicating in some way that others know about it, but they're not acting on it.
I'd like to briefly answer that question and turn it over to the true expert, Lou Bach.
If you can do it really briefly, I probably spoke too long myself, but I had to get that point out. I want to hear from some others.
Some of these things could simply be outliers, right? So what it's going to require is field investigation, and that's not happening. But to answer your question, yes, it happens all the time, and I know Lou can add to that.
Let me give you a better example, okay, that happens all the time and has happened for a long time. We were looking years ago at the movement of gold, all different types of gold. You're familiar, you have wives and girlfriends and people you buy jewelry for, 24-karat gold, best quality you can get. You can look to a market indicator and know what that's trading for. Anybody can do this. In a $13 per unit market, we had stuff coming in from countries where gold never existed. It was being called scrap, and was being brought into the United States for $30 a unit. There's nobody going to pay that. It's common sense. I can't tell you about the cattle because, as John said, they're outliers. But we can see consistent patterns of over-invoicing of goods of different quality, diamonds, consistently. Now, why are they doing it? Some of it's because of money laundering. They're illegally transferring profits from drugs. Some of it's tax avoidance. Some of it, there's any number of good reasons why they may be doing it. The problem is it's consistent, it's going on all the time, and it's difficult to get somebody to get. We had a guy actually go into a place and ask, how are you getting goods from this country, gold in particular, and it doesn't exist. The guy said to him right to his face, a criminal investigator, it's not coming from there. We're smuggling it from someplace else. To me, that would have been
Let me ask, we go to another area quickly. Would legalizing drugs have a positive or a negative impact on this illicit trade? Yes, sir.
Money launderers, traffickers of all kinds of things, and terrorist financiers take whatever opportunity is available to them. If you legalize one, they will turn to something else because that's where the profits are going to be. When you ask how often these $900 buckets are identified, you can see them everywhere. Licorice, we import from everywhere at below $1 a unit, and when it comes to Syria, it goes to 26, 29. You go to Taiwan, it goes to 200. We send chicken, we show exports of chicken to Colombia. You look at Colombia, no imports of chicken from the United States. Where did chicken go? We lose the chicken. Right? Now, any commodity you look at, you have no idea. You sit down with Lou Bach in an afternoon, and you're going to see any commodity you look at, legal commodity, and you will find that problem.
Let me get one more question in, please. If we do some of the things that I contemplate doing, my suspicion is that we'll have some legitimate business persons who will give a little bit of pushback, and I'm being a bit euphemistic with my terminology. What would you say to the legitimate business people who will voice their concerns in a legitimate way?
One of the problems we experienced when we first brought this out was we did not want to tell the foreign governments exactly who the United States exporters were, because there's so much things that are going on where pricing is over and under, they're moving money from one place to another. If you give, I'm making this up, please don't, Lubach Enterprises, I sell tons of electronic goods. The minute you find somebody that's got deep pockets and is doing some various small infraction, that's who they go after. We want them to go after the people who are truly laundering money. We don't want them looking at General Motors. We don't want them looking at IBM. They're doing something, and maybe tax fraud, but it's not what we're looking for.
Can Mr. Casares respond? I see that he wants to, Mr. Chairman.
Can you do so quickly, Mr. Casares?
Yes, just to my opinion on your last question, I think legitimate businesses will welcome trade transparency because it's a level playing field. Particularly American businesses, they should welcome this.
Gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our witnesses. To Mr. Casera, thank you for your career in addressing trade-based money laundering. And I know you've, in your testimony, you stated that trade-based money laundering and value transfer, including all of its varied forms, is perhaps the largest and most pervasive money laundering methodology in the world. My question to you is a pretty simple one. Compared to other forms of terror finance, how problematic is trade-based money laundering as a method for terrorists?
I believe trade-based money laundering is a major problem, but it again depends on the part of the world you're talking about. Certainly if you're talking about South Asia, you're talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Afghan transit rate, it's absolutely huge. Areas in Libya and Somalia, it's huge. In other areas, perhaps not as important. But what is overlooked is the fact of trade-based value transfer, particularly the countervaluation we were talking about earlier, and its relationships to all kinds of indigenous underground financial systems employed by our adversaries. We've not focused on that, and we should.
A common theme has kind of come up in all of the testimony, at least that I can discern. In Mr. Mesko's testimony, I think he puts it probably most succinctly, where he says that nobody has the whole picture. In other words, nobody is making full use of the range of data available to them in the public domain. The key to detecting and preventing increasingly complex TBML schemes is data integration within the government, within the private sector, between the two, and for all stakeholders. Everybody needs to aggregate the information to connect the dots, so to speak. So to that end, and others have said something similar to that end, is the solution Mr. Cassara's invention, which is these TTUs, and what is the key to standing up more of them in other places around the world?
I'll let them speak to the TTU question, but I think, you know, one sort of illustrative way of thinking about this is, let's say that, you know, all of our different banks are stovepiped. You know, they're not sharing their compliance data with one another, and we have 5 top banks in Mexico, and we go in and we say, look, one of them says, I used this open source data. I found that there were some relationships of concern with this party. You know, he's been transacting with, you know, a known Hezbollah operative, whatever the case may be. That account gets closed down without information sharing between those banks. He just goes around the corner to a peer institution and opens another account. And I think that's the problem that I'm trying to address in that testimony.
Dr. Passes?
And that's the problem with the cost and the duplication of the effort, because if one bank finds me as a terrorist financier and chases me away, they do not tell anyone else about this, and I go all around until I find a bank that will welcome me, and I will change my name in the process. So if you have one place that does the consolidated risk management and red flags that, then you do that saving.
Is part of the problem that we don't have TTUs involving trade transactions outside of the United States, where the United States is not a party? I mean, how do we encourage countries where there's a trade transaction, a fraudulent trade transaction, and the United States is not a party? I would think that there would be, because we have a more sophisticated and aggressive approach to this problem, that a lot of these illicit transactions are occurring between parties where the United States is not in the middle.
Well, in my experience in many different countries, you have different government structures. So you have the customs on the one hand, and you have the entity that does the FIU function. They are located in different parts. Sometimes it's police, sometimes it's the central bank, sometimes it's a ministry. Having one definition where everything has to fit may not be the way to go forward. Define the function and the kind of information that needs to come together, and then find what are the entities in different countries that need to contribute. So it's the concept of what needs to be done, the data integration and analysis and the sharing, and then move with the labeling.
Mr. Cassara, is there any way we can encourage more TTUs in other parts of the world?
I'd like to see regional TTUs. For example, we're talking about threat finance. One of the reasons we established TTUs originally was to get at terror finance. So if you had a regional TTU, for example, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Dubai, that whole area there would be great. You could set up another one around Iraq and the surrounding areas, and Turkey and other logical trading partners. I would like to see TTUs, in theory, under the HSI ICE umbrella, but they don't have to be. Any country can stand up their own TTU using trade data, financial intelligence, and other data they have.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maine, Mr. Poliquin is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, very much, and thank everyone for being here. I think we can all agree that one of the primary or the primary responsibility of government is to keep American families safe. And I think we can also probably agree that for all kinds of reasons, we are losing the war on terror. Now, we can turn this around. We all know we can do that. And one of the key things to do that is, in fact, to make sure we choke off the funding that goes to terrorist organizations, which is in part what this is all about. Now, we also all know that a stable government, whatever type of system it is, promotes a stable economy. And when you have both that are stable, you have more opportunity, better lives, better jobs, better futures. And that in itself promotes more stability and less likelihood to embrace terrorist organizations. Now, Mr. Casala, I would, am I pronouncing your name? Mr. Casara, I beg your pardon. I'd like you to talk a little bit, if you can, please, about what spots around the world have you seen where, in particular, the activity of stealing goods, selling them cheaply in order to provide funding for terrorist organizations is starting to or has destabilized local economies and therefore local governments and therefore breeding grounds for terrorist activities that can keep our families in jeopardy.
Global financial integrity, a nonprofit. In fact, there's a few representatives sitting behind me have done some incredibly useful studies about illicit financial flows from the developing world. And literally trillions of dollars, well, about 1.3 trillion, if I'm not mistaken, over the last 10 years have gone out of the developing world, mostly through abusive trade misinvoicing. This type of thing directly affects the developing world. It affects the standard of living. It enables kleptocrats. It's all different kinds of wealth transfers. And this is a type of thing on almost a social level that breeds corruption. I'm sorry, that breeds, breeds corruption. It also brings instability.
Sure. So, Mr. Casara, let's drill down a little bit more on that if we can. Is there a way that we can use the data that's available to us through all the good work that's done in the nonprofit sector, the private sector, and various governments around the world to identify or give a heads up to countries who may in fact be susceptible to this sort of activity that would destabilize their economies and therefore their governments and therefore invite terrorist activity? Is there a way we can identify the types of products or goods and services that they should be on the lookout for because of the inherent nature of the country itself or the existing economies? Is there a way we can mine the data to give them heads up so we can work with them?
There are some real experts here that have a very, very good understanding of the data that's available. But the kind of thing that you just talked about, yes, it is possible to do that. It is possible to do that. And the other thing, because we just briefly touched on corruption, for example, the great enabler, the great facilitator for a lot of this stuff that goes on in these areas, in theory, that analysis could be done outside of the countries. It could be done here. It could be done in our intelligence communities.
Dr. Passas, you were about to chime in.
Yeah, I can give you one example, and that is the pharmaceutical industry.
Say it again.
The pharmaceutical industry. Okay, there you have not only misinvoicing, but you also have counterfeiting, which is a public health as well as a cost issue. And you have also cargo theft, and we do not know who is stealing, who is selling, and who is making use of the funding. We haven't looked. What we know in the private sector is that these are problems that affect the bottom line and the public health of the sick populations, but no one is looking. We need to look.
Who would be the entity, or what would be the entity that in fact would perform that function to the best of your knowledge?
Well, we have started an initiative with a number of pharmaceutical companies to do exactly that. We are at the initial stages, but in Boston at Northeastern, we are beginning this.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I really appreciate this. We need to learn as much as we can to stop this and keep our families safe. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back my time.
Gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank this distinguished panel for being with us. Appreciate your leadership. Clearly, in this war on terrorism, diplomatic, military, and financial means are all equally important to winning this global war. And so I commend the chairman and the ranking member for renewing our task force. On standing up TTUs in select regions, so setting a priority to do that, what is the enabling organization to do that? How do we diplomatically, through the Treasury on a multilateral basis, carry out that mission and then aid that being accomplished in a region? Mr. Cassara.
Part of that, as you said, it's kind of a multi-pronged approach. Some of this gets done via the State Department. Some of it gets done via funding by the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, INL. Of course, we have customs attachés assigned overseas, and they also participate in the facilitation of that. There's a lot of delegations that go back and forth. So it's a multi-pronged effort. There's not one particular model.
You know, during the Bush administration, when Treasury was standing up and as you talked about, Mr. Bach, unfortunately moving bureaus into the new Homeland Security Department, I agree with the comments made that some of that's not been done in the right way. There was a lot of high-level engagement on terror finance, trade-based terror finance, money terror finance. My question is, to your knowledge, does the NSC staff treat this as a top priority and therefore do a coordinative effort on the White House staff to keep a focus on this in our national security apparatus? Because, to your point, these interagency things just don't get done. You've got commerce people, you've got customs people, you've got DEA attachés out in our embassies, and everybody works up their chain of command. And so while I think Treasury is in charge of this in a general way, have they exhibited that in a regular sort of NSC briefing process? Who wants to tackle that one? And I know you don't work in the government now. You're giving your opinion about how it should be done.
In my opinion, this whole issue of trade-based money laundering, there continues to be a lack of awareness. And you mentioned, for example, DEA, IRS, even FinCEN, whatever. As far as trade-based money laundering and associated issues, the federal, state, and local level, there still is a lack of awareness and understanding of this. There just is.
Anybody else want to add, Dr. Pissarro?
Yeah, this relates also to the need-to-know question that was raised earlier. Yeah. You don't need to know necessarily the details of the information. All you need is the target. When you know what the target is, then you can give a heads up to institutions that collect that information, reverse engineer that into indicators of abuse and red flags, and then you can have a guidance that everybody looks out for. That is a much better way to do it, and you do not have to reveal methods or sources, anything, because then it becomes a law enforcement case that is usable in court.
Right. Well, I've been a banker for 30 years, and I'm certainly familiar with the money laundering aspect of it, and been a Treasury official in my past, so I respect both sides. But you talked about massive false positives, and that's a theme that we've heard about consistently over the past months of this task force. We collect a lot of data, but nobody does anything with it. And the very people who could help us on a targeting basis, are not privy to how to help in a way. So to me, setting priorities, how that's done, sharing information, and having liability protection and sharing that information like we have in SARS now for civil liability for in a loan type situation. Integrating that data and then focusing on it is the only way we're going to tackle this. And our Vice Chairman, Mr. Pittenger, had an excellent roundtable on just Bank Secrecy Act issues where 80% of the cash transaction people in the world were sitting at that table. And they said, we could be so much more effective if you just would tell us what you're looking for. We do that in criminal investigations. In my old bank branches, an FBI agent or a U.S. attorney person would walk in and say, hey, we need to know all about Joe. And that was just to a branch manager. There was no legal person involved in it. And I don't think we need to have this information sharing. Instead of collecting the hay, we just need to be told who the pin is and let us go get them.
I think it's exactly right. And the banks right now, all they care about is avoid any heavy sanction and reputational damage. They're not looking for bad guys. They're not looking for offenders and terrorist financiers.
Right. It's a box
This
checking
is what needs to
exercise.
change.
And they're spending millions on it. And people,
Right.
thousands of people working on that box checking piece. What they're all willing to do, I think, they're all very bright
and when you
people,
look at
is
my-
be targeted to do a better job on behalf of the American people by being letting in, as you say, not without the sources and methods knowledge, but just here's the target list, you need to help us.
And the targets can be formed with this work. I mean, if you look at the diagrams in the written statement,
Yes.
it just jumps out like a fly in the milk.
Right.
And that is not the sort of thing that you need any clearance for. It's out there, it is public.
Thank you for your forbearance, Mr. Chairman, on the time. I yield back.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In many ways, Mr. Hill was actually sort of grabbing sort of some of the direction I wanted to go. My understanding as of yesterday, we now have 9 Iranian banks that have access to the SWIFT system. How does that work in a world now where an institution anywhere in the world now has the traditional backbone moving money through? SWIFT and its charter is supposed to eliminate dodgy actors, but in this case, we know a couple of those 9 actually have some real interesting things in their history. So if you're collecting data, but it's coming through the legitimate backbone, and this may be more for Mr. Is it Mesko, with your data analytics background, comes in a very legitimate platform, but parts of that transaction may be also moving bad actors' money. How do you segment it?
It's an excellent question, and I don't have, unfortunately, I don't think there's necessarily an easy answer to it. Our financial sector and the financial sectors in our sort of partner nations, friendly nations, are always going to be at the mercy of the controls that their downstream, that their correspondent partners have, their banking partners in emerging markets and frontier markets have in place.
Well, as you use the term frontier markets, can I beg of you to go a couple steps further? Let's use a Hezbollah, I can't do the phlegm thing, Hezbollah example, where they had some very legitimate looking front ends that had, Lebanese banking interests or relationships. In some ways, you've just put them back into the mainstream system. How do you identify the bad actor here when the conduit is what the international system uses?
Right. And I think that I've obviously spoken a lot on open source today and the use of open source data and how you can map these networks and identify threat actors. I don't want to leave you with the impression that you're going to necessarily find to some degree of some evidentiary standard that some transaction coming out of Lebanon is linked to Iran or whatever. What I think the point is that, as Dr. Pasas said as well, we need to refine our understanding of what the actual typologies are of these new threats so that banks, whether or not they can put the full picture together, can get better information to law enforcement and to regulators to be able to pursue cases.
Okay, Doctor, I see you, and a little bit of refining. I have a personal fixation that we're allowing our own networks to be used against us.
Right. Well, the crooks like to hide in the crowds. That's the way it happens in economic crime, in organized crime, in terrorism finance. It's the same thing. So the whole point is to find in the big crowds the bad elements, the irregularities. That is what this analytics does. This is what the process that has been in use. In fact, we've been doing this with Lubbock to find precisely what is wrong. We were for 3 days in the Dominican Republic. There was a gold case that was more than $100 million, as it turned out.
It was just there.
Okay. In the last 60 seconds we have, we had some testimony in one of our earlier hearings that the confluence of terrorism, people who were producing fake products, copyright type infringements, cartels, and in many ways they were using some of the very same brokers to wash money. It was actually a profession. My questions. Professional money laundering. What's the fee structure these days? Are they guns for hire? Do they care whether they're washing and moving money for terrorism or a drug cartel? And how formal are those networks out there now for moving money around for these bad actors?
Well, it depends on the terrorist group that you look at. It depends on the commodity and the part of the world you're looking at. If you're looking at Islamic State, you want to see who's buying oil, who's buying antiquities, who's providing the finance, who's driving it around, who is providing insurance. Maybe there can be barter deals, right? So you want to see who are the supporters, who are the facilitators, corruption too.
And I know I'm out of time, but if you look over the last couple decades, we had a number of terrorism groups that finance their bad activities through opium, through cocaine, whether it be FARC, whether it be in Afghanistan. And so it was almost a bilateral trade mechanic where they were selling a illicit commodity, gaining cash, and then buying their weapons of destruction. So I have a great interest in the movement of both the commodity and the cash. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cassar, I just want to follow up a little bit. Congressman Williams had brought in the subject of TPP, which you mentioned in your testimony. You suggest that every TPP signatory country should establish a trade transparency unit and share appropriate targeted trade data to spot anomalies that could be indicative of trade fraud and money laundering. Do you know whether this was ever proposed by the administration during the TPP negotiations?
I do not know.
Should it have been?
Short answer, yes.
You mentioned in your written testimony that our network of operational trade transparency units includes the following 11 countries: Argentina, Australia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, and the Philippines. Of these, the U.S. currently has free trade agreements with 7: Australia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, and Peru. To your knowledge, do any of these trade agreements include provisions that directly relate to trade transparency or otherwise advance the goal of establishing TTUs?
I do not know, I'm sorry.
Mr. Bach, according to a December 2015 report by the nonprofit group Global Financial Integrity, the largest exporter of illicit money over the last decade has been China. Moreover, last September, U.S. authorities charged a group of Colombians with participating in a China-based criminal operation that laundered more than $5 billion from the United States, parts of Africa, Europe, and countries in Latin America. According to the indictment, the Guangzhou organization used Chinese casinos, currency exchange houses, and export companies and factories to receive billions of dollars in illicit drug proceeds. With that said, how big of a problem is China with respect to trade-based money laundering?
The relationship, as I remember it, the relationship between Colombia and the United States was Colombia gave us data that was only U.S.-centric, okay? And John had mentioned before about regional trade transparency units. It depends on the agreement we have. If the country only gives us the information between their country and our country, that's all we can focus on. This material you're talking about in China would have been nice to see, but I don't know whether or not they're supplying it to us. It would have been found if we had been looking at the entire Colombia database, okay? These countries want to share each other's data, okay? And if we can act as a broker, for instance, Colombia very much wanted to see what Panama was doing. But the arrangement was between Colombia and the United States and Panama and the United States. I don't know if they ever got together and created the regional TTU. But all these countries want to share the data, especially if they can have our data in exchange.
Could any of the panelists address what we could be doing to address, to better address trade-based money laundering with China?
I think one, in my view, you always provide incentives for people to do the right thing, and I think the incentive is the revenue raising and the fighting of illicit financial flows. That is a top concern in China as well, and I think that can be the focus of attention.
Mr. Cassara, the 2007 National Money Laundering Strategy identified attack trade-based money laundering at home and abroad as one of its key goals. An action item in the strategy was the establishment of TTUs in the Philippines and Malaysia. To date, however, there are no TTUs formally established outside of the Western Hemisphere. What has the President and his administration done, if anything, to carry out this goal?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I'm not privy to internal conversations, obviously, within the administration, but the reason we're here is not enough has been done to combat trade-based money laundering in general and establish trade transparency units in particular, which is part of the U.S. national anti-money laundering strategy.
General question for the panel. Do we know of countries where government officials are actively and affirmatively facilitating trade-based money laundering as opposed to some kind of neglect? Do we have any information on that? Anybody?
There's been times when we pointed out to different governments that there were big issues with very large industries, and for some reason, unbeknownst to me,
what would some of those countries be?
Most of the countries in South America, okay? When you have something that is linking to the largest industries in the countries, they're protective of their industries. Whether it's corruption, I'm not sure.
Yield back.
Without objection, we're going to recognize the gentleman from California for questions, Mr. Royce, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I guess the real surprise here is just how much money we're talking about in terms of revenues to these governments in the Western Hemisphere and across the developing world. You're talking about hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of helping us balance our books and helping those governments as well. So I think civil society, if it was really focused on just how much money you're talking about here, would be bolt upright in terms of trying to figure out a structure in which to capture this information in order to try to capture the revenue flows back to the governments related to this. So the World Customs Organization, is that the entity that we should consider maybe the platform for enforcement if we were to work internationally, or is it the OECD? Is it their financial action task force that has that 40+9 recommendations? Is there a way to maybe incorporate this into that entity with the understanding there of how much we're talking about in terms of potential revenue, and therefore that certainly could compensate for taking on that added burden on the part of that institution? Where would you begin? And first, what would be the practical problems with establishing such a platform? And second, what would be the political problems maybe in doing it?
If I could, I will be doing this in the near future at the International Anti-Corruption Academy to engage in concrete collective actions against lack of integrity, including in trade. So the answer to your question is all of the above. GFI and other NGOs are engaged in this. The OECD is focused on that. There are UN conventions against transnational organized crime, against terrorism finance, and against corruption that have relevant provisions that all countries on the planet are bound by. So you have the handles to do all this, and what you can do then with the incentive or revenue raising and better governance and therefore development, foreign investment, and all the things, the good stuff that comes after this, you provide the incentives for integrity. You bring all of the actors together, they contribute their brains and their data, you do the analysis, you feed it back, you turn the lights on. That's why I was saying that the answer is within reach.
Other participants in the panel?
Since 9/11, either myself or the people that worked for me in the group that I managed visited 40 countries on behalf of Commissioner Bonner, who was in charge of customs at the time, and we were trying to extend our borders out with the Container Security Initiative. Of the countries that we visited, and some of these were former Soviet countries, every single person we demonstrated the program to, where do we get a copy of this? And I had permission to give this to the law enforcement people, okay? And we often made it available. Now, they got the program, we handed it, we owned the program, so we were able to give it to them. We had countries that don't give us anything. The Netherlands wanted to hand us a disk, and actually did hand us a disk and said, here's our data. We couldn't go back to our organization. The programmers, they wanted the Netherlands to pay for the processing of the data. When we had funding, we were able to take this data and do it. The biggest problem is going to be that when you have a country, the United States has a different bookkeeping system than everywhere else in the customs world. That's a blanket statement. Most of the countries use a system called Asakuda. We don't use that. Their data is in one format. We don't accept it, according to our IT people, unless they present it in our format. It costs a lot of money to do this. We could just as easily have it done ourselves, and we did while we were funded. Now, when you go out to somebody, they want money to convert the data. These people just want to give it to us, as long as we give us their, we share with them. And I would be willing to bet we could extend this thing to 40 countries probably within very short order, if we had money to do it.
In the international community, the Financial Action Task Force makes things happen regarding anti-money laundering, counterterrorism finance. One of the recommendations I have in the book and in my prepared statement is I believe we should go to our U.S. Department of Treasury, who heads up our U.S. government Financial Action Task Force delegation, and ask them to study the possibility of having trade-based money laundering, having trade-based money laundering be the next FATF recommendation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks. I thank the panel. I thank you for your continued focus on this. And I think later we can have some conversations between the members here who, some like Mr. French Hill, have got a little bit of understanding from being over in Treasury as to some of the bureaucratic impediments. Maybe we can come up. Maybe we can keep a dialogue going, Mr. Chairman, with the panel as we try to work with some of the government agencies here on the next step. But thank you again for the hearing.
Agreed. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank to the panelists. I've been listening to some of the questions and some of in your testimony, and this is complicated. I guess I'll direct my first question to Mr. Bach, because, and just thinking about it, what makes this hard, I think, to fight against TBML, among other things, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure I come down, I'm a big guy that believes in trade, and the world is much smaller and interconnected, and we're trading back and forth, and we enter into trade agreements, and then you look at the enormous volume of trade flows, which obscures individual transactions and provides abundant opportunity for criminal organizations to transfer value across borders. The complexity of, I think that you were just talking about, of associated with foreign exchange transactions, and then the additional complexity that can arise from the practice of commingling illicit funds with the cash flows of legitimate businesses, and then the limited recourse to verification procedures or exchange customs data between countries. So when I look at how complicated all these challenges are, it becomes clear. And then, you know, what you were just talking about on our side, looking on our side of what we can do in our government, but wouldn't it seem that there should be, you know, we're doing some kind of international harmonization with cross-border systems of verification and data exchange? Do you see any harmonization of international cooperation to combat TBML?
I think that we're on the, excuse me, I think we're on the right steps to it. The government already, all the governments follow a harmonized system of tariffs. That's the description of the goods, okay? And when we look at the rest of the world, they're all in harmony with the way they do their business. We are the ones that are out of harmony, but we're the biggest economy, okay? And we set the rules. We did it long before anybody else did, so we're set in our ways. We can easily adjust our data to match the rest of the world's. It's not difficult. The problem is we need the wherewithal to do it. And I mean, of course, I'm not with the government anymore, so I'm not asking you for any money, but the agencies need the money to normalize our data with the foreign countries.
So it would be a matter of money. Wouldn't be like, I mean, well, at one time, you know, we were the ones still on using inches and everybody else is using centimeters. And so we just couldn't get used or change to a different dialogue. So it's not that complicated, is it, as far as the different systems are concerned? Is it just a matter of trying to, some financing and some money to put it on pause so that we can do some harmonization?
That's what I would say, yeah. We've already, the government's already paid to take our data and make it match everybody else.
Yes, sir.
In addition to that, what you have is pretty standardized private sector records and data. People, beyond what the governments require, need to communicate. So the equivalent of the SWIFT messaging that you have for financial transactions exists with respect to trade transactions. It's massive, however, and you need the infrastructure to receive it and analyze it. But that is part of the data set that you can put together.
Now, the other thing that comes into mind, because, you know, when we do these trade agreements, I've been a big proponent of it, but I also want to bring in some of the less developed countries because I want them to get involved in the global economy. But of course, less developed countries by nature have huge informal economies where it's hard to sometimes trace and verify even the legitimate commercial transactions. So what would you say? You know, how do we bring them in? Do they have even the capacity to work with us also to meet some of these challenges?
Look, even if the countries don't even have computers in them, all the countries that supply goods to these foreign countries, to this country, have records. It got there on a ship. That ship is making records of how it got there. It's telling everybody, this thing went from our place to your place, and whether the person who got it tells us anything, we can still know what's going on. And that's the part we're trying to push here. When I read to you about the manifest data, the shipping companies actually gave us the data of all the worldwide movements of cargo. We put it in a database. You could watch all the zigs and the zags of the container. We built a system around that. They're willing to do that. It cost them nothing to give us that. All we had to do is put a computer in place to make it work. That gives you a chance to look into the country that does not have the data, okay? And that's where the value comes from building this thing. I mean, maybe sound crazy, but it actually works, you know. And we had it working. It was funded. I don't want to get into that part of it all, okay? Yes, but when the funding went away, all the advancement of moving this forward kind of came to a halt. And I think, in fact, so did the acquisition of new TTUs, because there's, you know, you need some money to go back and forth and whatever. I don't want to lecture you. Does that help you?
No,
Could I add something to that? You know, when the American embassies were bombed in Africa, in the trial that we had in New York, we had part of the evidence, the $1,000 that went from Kuwait and Yemen to Nairobi to help finance it. So that was way before 9/11 and the new rules requiring records for informal remitters. They had those records that were produced in evidence. There are records. It's a myth that there is no paperwork and trail to follow in informal economies and in informal hawala business. We have used in the US and in Britain indicators of abuse so that you can identify which transactions are okay, honest money from migrants to their families, and what is not. This is the kind of red flagging exercise that we can do, even in places where you only have paper records and no computers. And you combine all that together with the other data that we have. And the World Bank and entities like USAID and so on, they do governance and capacity building everywhere in the world. That can be part of that program.
Without objection, we're going to proceed to with the permission of the panel, an expedited sort of second round of questions. We'll begin with Ranking Member Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Passos, in your testimony, I might have read it in one of your previous articles, you took the position that the work we're doing with hawalas is perhaps overdone, that the attention, the amount of attention that hawalas have received is probably too much. Is that because you feel that we have bigger fish to fry with with trade-based money laundering, or do you feel that that hawalas are so small, or the risk is so small that we shouldn't be focusing on them as much?
There are risks with hawala, and we do have cases both of terrorism finance and trade-based money laundering or other money laundering that goes through them. They can be abused just like any financial instrument or institution. Not as much, perhaps, because what we have not done well is to actually leverage the information nodes in the hawala networks. When you go to ask the right questions, you get the right answers. In Mumbai, the attacks of Mumbai and the Indian parliament, those cases were solved because of hawala collaboration. In Dubai, the Dubai police and DEA made a big money laundering case with trade because of hawala information. Right. They are a resource. We're not using it. Instead, we're regulating as if it were a formal institution, and we're requiring things they cannot provide. And as a result, we do not have the kind of collective action with the Somalis. We had a meeting, and in fact, we lost a dear colleague. He was assassinated in Somalia last year. He was trying to separate the good with the bad money in Somalia, right? You can do this. There are ways of achieving this. But what we have done is just regulate them in a way that requires things that cannot be accomplished. They are ready to collaborate. They are ready to provide the evidence. They are ready to put the data in a clearinghouse that can be analyzed. That's what we need.
Yeah. The problem for us is, you're right, and we were very early on, when we were setting up FIUs, we saw that there was a gap on hawalas. So we asked the host governments to begin to register hawalas and hawaladas. So that much, at least we've got them on the grid in many cases. But and many of them keep meticulous records of each and every transaction, because the success of any hawalada is really on their reputation. And so there's a huge risk of reputational damage if they're seen as facilitating funds for a terrorist organization. I mean, it's over for them. But still, the informal nature of that value transfer system, in my mind, we need to do more with them and not less.
The federal regulatory regime is fine. The problem that we have is the state regulatory regime that requires all kinds of resources that are not available. And I can share that with you in detail. With respect to the risks, they know their customer much better than banks sometimes, especially in parts of the world where banks aren't there. This is an intelligence asset. This is an ally against terrorism. Right. Islamic State and Shabab are going after these guys. They are enemies. That's what I meant by saying they have enemies everywhere. Let's use the enemies and go after the easy, the low-hanging fruit, like ISIS and like Shabab that everybody's against, and we can bring all that together. So That information can be leveraged, that information can be provided, and once we have the communities together, they can smell the rat, they do not want terrorists, they will work with us. That's the best community policing against terrorism.
We're having my last quick question is we're having a very, very difficult time in Somalia. All of the traditional banks and money processors are out of there now. So the only opportunity I think we have in the short term is really to deal with the hawalas in that area. Is that something that you think is possible, or should we try to stay away from that?
It is possible, and what we had was we were with the 18 companies from Somalia. We were in Vienna at the United Nations, and we were trying to do exactly this. That's how our colleague, French colleague, was killed,
right.
and a British former Scotland Yard colleague. Right. It can be done, and it must be done. And there is an initiative, the Safe Corridors, that is underway. There has been work also by NGOs on looking at what the impact of current regimes is. There are questions about risk and how we define it and how we do the de-risking in a way that we do not grow the systemic risk. There are handles. There are ways of doing this, and I can send you separately, if you wish, the recommendations that we worked out.
All right. We are having problems, even Somali families in the United States getting remittances back to that country. We're having great difficulty because there's no institution that we can go through right now. But I thank you, and I'll take that, any recommendations you have offline. Thank you.
Vice Chairman, Mr. Pittenger is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Misko, I would like you just to clarify what you mean by non-indexed data.
Certainly. A better term for that might be ungoogleable, not available on search engines.
Okay, that's helpful. I'd just like to summarize some of what you all have presented today, which has been extraordinarily helpful. As I see it from Mr. Bach, you said that this data is accessible. The countries have it. They want to present it. We need to consolidate it. We need to analyze it. And then through that, we need to be able to have an enforcement capacity, all of which requires funding. It is your assessment that those resources that is available through the revenue from this expanded transparency?
Yes, absolutely. We've had, over the years, we've had cases that countries, Argentina, Peru, had $100 million recoveries. We have a United States case where they recovered $100 million of tax on Freon, back in the days of the ozone-depleting chemicals, the hole in the earth, in the sky. They recovered $100 million. This whole project didn't cost $30 million.
Very good.
For 20 years.
My last observation is, you know, water finds its way downhill. And if it hits a block here, it goes another way. Another way, the speaker has put it quite well in ice hockey is you look where the puck is headed and not where it is today. And as you assess the funding requirements for these terrorist organizations, and certainly we have continual need to track and intercept the transfer of money through these financial institutions. I'm particularly concerned about Iran with these banks now that are open to SWIFT access. But given if we will utilize the data and share the data, I know FinCEN has extraordinarily capable data capacities if it can be shared with the private sector as well as with our own government. Yet, while we're somewhat effective in that, it seems to me that our adversaries recognize that we haven't been effective in TBML. And do you believe that this will, as such, be a growing factor that we should be looking at, that should be more of the focus? They're pretty smart people. They know what we're good at and what we're not good at.
When you have all this data amassed, the beauty of it all is it's like fishing in a barrel, okay? They can do what they want to hide. You catch them here. We've stopped things. There's been big cases that Customs made, DEA made, polar cap and this and that, and you could see when you squeezed it here, it popped up somewhere else. If you have the database in place and you're looking at trade, You can see it. When we squeezed one place, Mexico went up. All of a sudden, Mexico was shipping gold. It's exactly, the analogy of water is perfect. It will find another level. But if you have the data in a place where you're looking back, you can see the bulges elsewhere. And that's probably the most interesting part of this whole exercise for me. You can do some predictive work.
Thank you. This has been extraordinarily helpful. I very much appreciate you being with us. I yield back.
I'd like to again thank our witnesses for their testimony here today, and it's our hope that if you have continuing thoughts or suggestions for us that you'll provide it either to individual members or to the panel as a whole. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses, and I would just ask that the witnesses please respond as promptly as they're able. Without objection, this hearing is adjourned.
Nice job, Mike.
All right, Steve.